Hey you guys, welcome back to book club. So we're entering a new chapter. This is the beginning of... No, we're not entering a new chapter. It's a new, it's still chapter 2, In Search of a Deeper Order. Part 3, Synchronicity and its Implications. Synchronicity and its Implications. So this section was a little bit longer than the last one, but I'm going to go for it. Most of us in the course of life have observed coincidences in which two or more independent events having no apparent causal connection nevertheless seem to form a meaningful pattern. On occasion, this patterning can strike one as so extraordinary that it's difficult to believe the coincidence has been produced by chance alone. The events give the distinct impression of having been precisely arranged or invisibly orchestrated. Jung first described the remarkable phenomenon he named synchronicity in a seminar as early as 1928. He continued his investigations for more than 20 years before at last attempting a full formulation in the early 1950s. He presented his influential, still evolving analysis of synchronicity in the final paper he gave at the Uranos conferences, and immediately followed this with the long monograph. Developed in part through discussions with physicists, particularly Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli, the principle of synchronicity bore parallels to certain discoveries in relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Yet, because of its psychological dimension, Jung's concept possessed a special relevance for the schism in the modern worldview between the meaning-seeking human subject and the meaning-voided objective world. From the beginning, it has held a unique position in contemporary discussions, having been simultaneously described by physicists as posing a major challenge to the philosophical foundation of modern science, and by religious scholars as holding deep implications for the modern psychology of religion. With each decade, increasing numbers of books and heightened attention, both scholarly and popular, have been devoted to the concept and the phenomenon. Jung took particular interest in meaningful coincidences, in the beginning no doubt because their frequent occurrence had exerted a considerable influence on his own life experience. He also observed that in the therapeutic process of his patients, such events repeatedly played a role, sometimes a powerful one, especially in periods of crisis and transformation. The dramatic coincidence of meaning between an inner state and the simultaneous external event seemed to bring forth in the individual a healing movement toward psychological wholeness, mediated by the unexpected integration of inner and outer realities. Such events often engendered a new sense of personal orientation in a world now seen as capable of embodying purposes and meanings beyond the mere projections of human subjectivity. The random chaos of life suddenly appeared to veil a deeper order. A subtle sign, as it were, had been given, an unexpected color in the pale void of meaning, an intimation, in William James's phrase, of something more. Is there something more? Accompanying the more profound occurrences of synchronicity was a dawning intuition, sometimes described as having the character of a spiritual awakening, that the individual was themselves not only embedded in a larger ground of meaning and purpose, but also in some sense a focus of it. This discovery, often emerging after a sustained period of personal darkness or spiritual crisis, tended to bring with it an opening to new existential potentialities and responsibilities. Both because of this felt personal import. I don't understand this part. This discovery tended to bring with it an opening to new existential potentials and responsibilities, both because of this felt personal import and because of its startling metaphysical implications. Such a synchronicity carried a certain numinosity. Remember, numinosity means the spirit of, or spirited. Carried a certain numinosity, a dynamic spiritual charge with transformative consequences for the person experiencing it. In this respect, the phenomenon seemed to function in religious terms as something like an intervention of grace. Jung noted that such synchronicities were often kept secret or carefully guarded to avoid the possibility of ridicule concerning an event possessing such significant personal meaning. The classic example of a pivotal synchronistic experience is Jung's well-known description of the Golden Scarab case. And then it's like a little story within here. So let's read about the Golden Scarab that Jung wrote. Okay. My example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day, with my back to the window, listening to the flow of her rhetoric. She had had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me the dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned around and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabæid beetle, or common rose chafer, Centenonia aurata, whose gold-green color most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment can now be continued with satisfactory results. Okay. The acute coincidence between the symbolically resonant image that the woman had experienced in her dream the night before and was just then recounting, and the spontaneous appearance at the window of an insect that was, quote, the nearest analogy to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes, effectively broke through the intellectual armoring that had been blocking her psychological development. Now her, quote, natural being could burst through, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. In another such instance, recounted in Esther Harding's notebooks, a patient whose dreams were filled with sexual imagery kept attempting to interpret the dreams in non-sexual symbolic terms, despite Jung's efforts to persuade her of their more plausible, straightforward meaning. On the day of her next appointment, 2 sparrows fluttered to the ground at the woman's feet and performed the act. On rare occasions, a synchronicity proves to have an extraordinary power through its impact on an historically significant individual, so that it ultimately plays a pivotal role in the collective life of the larger culture. The famous coincidence that formed a turning point in the life of Petrarch took place at the climax of his ascent of Mount Ventoux in April 1336. An event that has long been regarded by scholars as representing the symbolic beginning of the Renaissance. For many years, Petrarch had sensed a growing impulse to ascend the mountain to see the vast panorama from its peak, though doing such a thing was virtually unheard of in his time. Finally choosing the day with his brother for a companion, he made the long ascent, marked by intense physical exertion and inward reflection. While he at last attained the summit, with clouds below his feet and winds in his face, Petrarch found himself overwhelmed by the great sweep of the world that now opened out to him. Snow-capped mountains and the sea in the distance, rivers and valleys below, the wide expanse of skies in every direction. James Hillman recounts the event, quote, "At the top of the mountain, with the exhilarating view of French province, the Alps, and the Mediterranean spread before him, he had opened his tiny pocket copy of Augustine's Confessions. Turning at random to Book X 8, he read, 'And men go abroad to admire the heights of mountains, the mighty billows of the sea, the broad tide of the rivers, the compass of the ocean, and the circuits of the stars, and pass themselves by.'" Petrarch was stunned at the coincidence between Augustine's words and the time and place they were read. His emotion both announced the revelation of his personal vocation and heralded a new attitude of the Renaissance. Petrarch draws this crucial conclusion from Mount Ventoux event, quote, "Nothing is admirable but the soul." And then in Latin it says it too, "Nihil praeter animum esse mirabile." Okay. Petrarch was so moved by the coincidental force of Augustine's words that he remained silent to the entire descent down the mountain. He at once recognized the coincidence as part of a larger pattern of such transformative moments that had happened to others in the history of spiritual conversions. Quote, "I could not believe that it was by a mere accident that I happened upon them. What I had there read I believed to be addressed to me and to no other, remembering that St. Augustine had once suspected the same thing in his own case," unquote. For indeed, Augustine had undergone a nearly identical experience at his own momentous spiritual turning point. In the Garden of Milan in 386, in a frenzy of spiritual crisis, he heard a child's voice from a nearby house mysteriously repeating the words, "Tolle lege," pick up and read. Uncertain of their significance, he finally opened a random copy of St. Paul's epistles and there read words that spoke with uncanny precision to the nature of his lifelong conflict and its resolution, immediately after which, quote, "The light of certainty flooded my heart, and all dark shadows of doubt fled away," unquote. Here, too, Augustine's emotion in the Garden of Milan both announced the revelation of his personal vocation and heralded the new attitude of a Christian epoch being born. 1,000 years later, Augustine's own words, randomly encountered, provided a strikingly similar catalyzing force for Petrarch on Mount Ventoux. This time, the synchronistic epiphany unfolded in a new direction and with different consequences. One revelation in the garden pointing to Christianity in the Middle Ages, the other to the mountain pointing to the Renaissance and modernity. Jung believed the synchronicities generally seemed to serve the same role as dreams, psychological symptoms, and other manifestations of the unconscious, namely, to compensate the conscious attitude and move the psyche from a problematic one-sided toward greater wholeness and individuation. Not only did the unexpectedly externalized pattern of meaning seem to represent more than mere chance coincidence, it also appeared to serve a definite purpose, impelling the psyche toward a more complete psychological and spiritual realization of the individual personality. This self-realization was achieved through a deeper integration of conscious and unconscious, which ultimately required of the individual a discerning surrender of the usual conscious attitude of knowing superiority. In this view, the perceptive interpretation of synchronistic phenomena, as with all expressions of the unconscious, rather than inflating the egocentric importance of the individual in a narcissistic manner, could correct precisely these tendencies and open the psyche to a larger vision. An instructive example of this self-critical compensatory approach towards synchronicity in Jung's own life was recounted by Henry Fires when he described a meeting with Jung in the 1950s. Fires had come to discuss whether Jung thought a manuscript by a scientist who had recently died should be published. At the appointed hour of 5 o'clock, Fires arrived for the meeting and the discussion began. Quote, Jung had read the book, and he thought that it should not be published, but I disagreed and was for publication. Our discussion finally got rather sharp, and Jung looked at his wristwatch, obviously thinking he had spent enough time on the matter and that he could send me home. Looking at his watch, he said, "When did you come?" "At 5, as agreed." Jung says, "But that's queer. My watch came back from the watchmaker this morning after a complete revision, and now I have 5:05. But you must have been here for much longer. What time do you have?" It's 5:35. So Jung says, "So you have the right time, and I the wrong one. Let's discuss the thing again." This time I could convince Jung that the book should be published. I don't know, that anecdote was weird to me. Here, the synchronistic event of interest is not because of intrinsic coincidental force, but because the meaning Jung drew from it, essentially using it as a basis for challenging and redirecting his own conscious attitude. The unexpected stopping and resulting error of the watch was immediately recognized by Jung as paralleling and as thereby bringing to his attention what he then suspected might be a comparable stoppage and error in his own thinking about the matter at hand. He was alert to the fact that the two events, one inner and the other outer, would have taken place at virtually the same moment. Rather than automatically assuming that there could be no significant connection between the state of his watch and the state of his thinking, which would certainly be the usual assumption, his immediate intuition was of a larger field of meaning underlying and patterning all that happened in the room at that time. In that field, events having no apparent causal connection in the conventional sense could be recognized as participating in a more subtly ordered whole, a larger pattern of meaning that was discernible to the prepared mind, even if that meaning challenged his conscious attitude. For Jung, the symbolic connection between two events was as transparently intelligible as if he were reading a newspaper, and he acted accordingly. Oh, he's funny. What made the correlation between the inner and outer events intelligible was the presence of two factors. First, a developed capacity for thinking and perceiving symbolically, a cultivated sensitivity to metaphorical and analogical patterns that connect and thereby illuminate diverse phenomena, and second, an epistemological openness to the possibility that such meaning can be carried by the outer world as well as the inner, by all of nature and one's surrounding environment, not just by the human psyche. Yet the recognition of synchronicities requires subtle judgments made in circumstances usually pervaded by ambiguity and open to multiple interpretations. The suggestive patterning and often delicate precision of detail in such coincidences notoriously escape the net of objectivistic assessments and experimental tests. Synchronicities seem to constitute a lived reality, the experience of which depends deeply on the sensitive perception of context and nuance. For synchronicities have a shadow side, as in the exaggeration of the trivial to discover a self-inflating meaning. As in the exaggeration of the trivial to discover a self-inflating meaning. Another form the shadow can take is the paranoid's morbidly narrow interpretation of coincidences in terms of other people's malign plots, cunningly directed at the self, or psychotic delusions of self-reference. Such interpretations are, as Jung once suggested, pre-Copernican, egocentric. They centered the world of meaning naively on the old narrow self, inflating the separate ego or persecuting it, and thereby evade the more complex and often painful emergence of the individuated self that is in dialogue with the whole. Right. Such an emergence requires attending to the claims and culminations of the larger cosmos, the unconscious. A painstaking cultivation of self-knowledge must be undertaken to avoid succumbing to mere projection. A painstaking cultivation of self-knowledge must be undertaken to avoid succumbing to mere projection. That is one to remember. Discriminating such events requires a self-critical awareness of unconscious tendencies towards narcissistic distortion by which random or peripheral events are continually transformed into signs of an egocentric universe. No less crucial is the development and balanced interplay of multiple faculties of cognition: empirical, rational, emotional, relational, intuitive, symbolic. A capacity for acute yet balanced discernment has to be forged, founded not only on an alertness to meaningful pattern, but also on a disciplined mindfulness of the larger whole within the individual's self-seeks orientation. A really good book about orientation is Sarah Ahmed, Queer Phenomenology. Read that. Today, a half-century after Jung's original formulation of the principle of synchronicity, with both the concept and the phenomenon now so widely recognized, one can discern a typical sequence and progression in the nature of synchronistic events and responses. The first stage is usually marked by an experience of various ambiguously suggestive coincidences and patternings that may seem somewhat remarkable, curious, or even vaguely uncanny, but can still be regarded as perhaps merely fortuitous or subjective, and are therefore usually ignored and forgotten. Fortuitous? I never know how to say that word. Okay, continuing. Eventually there may occur one or more especially powerful synchronicities, unambiguous in their coincidental force and precision of patterning, that have revelatory effect on the individual and mark a decisive threshold in his or her psychological and spiritual development. Not infrequently, synchronicities of this category occur in association with births, deaths, crises, and other crises, and other major turning points in life. So when you come to a juncture in life, which we all do, life and death, obviously huge junctures in life. Other things would be like any crisis or a turning point, like a major event, a marriage maybe, or a graduation, or anything that significantly alters the course of your life. Those are the times when we believe synchronicities more often during those times. On occasion, there may take place a sudden convergence of many such synchronicities, intricately interconnected, occurring in close proximity or in rapid succession, and having the effect of an empowering epiphany of new meaning and purpose in the life of the individual. Yes, when we go through times that are like thresholds, we actually touch the other side in a more deep way than we do in just everyday experience. And those encounters with the other side are powerful, moving, transformative experiences, spiritually altering. And over time, however, after this threshold has been crossed, a new attitude towards synchronicities can often emerge as their frequency and character come to seem part of life's pervasive intelligence and artistry. Less a paradigm-shifting revelation of a new order of reality, and more a continuing source of meaning and orientation with which to participate in life with greater sensitivity and intelligence. A disciplined alertness to significant pattern in the outer world as well as inner beings to develop as an essential aspect of living a more conscious life. I maybe read that sentence wrong. The occurrence of synchronicities is seen as permitting a continuing dialogue with the unconscious and the larger whole of life, while also calling forth an aesthetic and spiritual appreciation of life's powers of symbolically resonant and complex patterning. I feel like the internet really helps people understand synchronicities, complex patterning, and emergence. Although Jung himself did not explicitly describe this later stage in the principal monograph on synchronicity, it is evident from many scattered passages in his writing and from the recollections and memoirs of others that he both lived his life and conducted his clinical practice in a manner that entailed a constant attention to potentially meaningful synchronistic events that would then shape his understanding and actions. Jung saw nature and one's surrounding environment as a living matrix of potential synchronistic meaning that could illuminate the human sphere. He attended to sudden or unusual movements or appearances of animals, flocks of birds, the wind, storms, and sudden louder lappings of the lake outside the window of his consulting room, and similar phenomena as possessing possible symbolic relevance for the parallel unfolding of interior psychological realities. That is interesting. It makes me think that the internet is kind of taking advantage of the synchronicity that is just inherent in all beings. Okay, so in sharp contrast to the modern worldview, Jung ceased to regard the outer world as merely a neutral background against which the human psyche pursued its isolated, intrasubjective quest for meaning and purpose. And this revelation that the background is not merely a background is a theme in a book I read called Hyperobjects, and it talks about global warming as a hyperobject and how there are beings that exist, basically. There are lots of different ways of being, and there are some really large beings that we can only see in kind of small fractal or pieces of. And so, let's say that again. In sharp contrast to the modern worldview painted a picture with foreground and background. But Jung ceased to regard the outer world as merely a neutral background for which the human psyche pursued its isolated, intrasubjective quest for meaning and purpose. Rather, all events, inner and outer, whether emanating from the human unconscious or from the larger matrix of the world, were recognized as sources of potential psychological and spiritual significance. From this perspective, not only the individual psyche and not only humans' collective unconscious, but all of nature supported and moved the human psyche towards a larger consciousness of purpose and meaning. Each moment in time possessed a certain tangible character or quality which pervaded the various events taking place at that moment. Then there's a block quote. It seems indeed as though time, far from being an abstraction, is a concrete continuum which contains qualities or fundamentals which can manifest themselves in relative simultaneousness in different places and in a parallelism which cannot be explained, as in cases of simultaneous appearance of identical thoughts, symbols, or psychic conditions. Whatever is born or done at this particular moment of time has the quality of this moment of time. That's nice. Central to Jung's understanding of such phenomena was his observation that the underlying meaning or formal factor that linked the synchronistic inner and outer events, the formal cause in Aristotelian terms, was archetypal in nature. Okay. Central to Jung's understanding was his observation that the underlying meaning that linked synchronistic inner and outer events was archetypal in nature. Building on insights from Freud and drawing from the classical Platonic philosophical vocabulary and from esoteric traditions, Jung had long regarded and defined archetypes as the fundamental governing principles of the human psyche. Oh, I didn't know that was a Jungian thing. On the basis of his own analysis as well as those of others, not only of a diverse range of clinical phenomenon, but also of the art, myths, and religions of many eras and cultures, Jung had come to view archetypes as innate symbolic forms and psychological dispositions that unconsciously structure and impel human behavior and experience at both the personal and collective level. They are, quote, self-portraits of the instincts and render human experience meaningful according to certain timeless universal patterns and forms, light and dark, birth and death, rebirth, the hero, the great mother, the child, the trickster, the shadow, good and evil, eros and logos, feminine and masculine, as well as more specifically personified and culturally inflected forms such as Aphrodite, Oedipus, Dionysus, Prometheus, Saturn, Shakti, Kali, Shiva, Wotan, Isis, and Sophia. Another major category of the archetypes comprises the mathematical principles of number and geometric form, as in the Pythagorean Platonic tradition, and traditional sacred forms such as the mandala, the circle, and the cross. All these principles were seen as possessing a primordial, mythic, and numinous character grounded in the deepest layers of the psyche and expressing a collective unconscious shared by all human beings. Yes, that's the power of a sign. Okay. For more of his career, Jung worked and wrote within the modern Cartesian Kantian philosophical framework of a basic division between the human subject and the objective world, and thus tended to restrict archetypes to the interior world of the human psyche. His view of archetypes in the early and middle periods of his career was generally equivalent to Kant's notion of a priori forms and categories. They were inherited psychological structures or dispositions that preceded and shaped the character of human experience, but could not be said to transcend the human psyche. In his later work, however, and most explicitly in the context of his analysis of synchronicities, Jung moved towards a conception of archetypes as autonomous patterns of meaning that inform both psyche and matter, providing a bridge between inner and outer. Quote, synchronicity postulates a meaning which is a priori in relation to human consciousness and apparently exists outside man. Jung's later work thus intimated the ancient understanding of an ensouled world, of an anima mundi in which the human psyche participates and with which it shares the same ordering principles of meaning. Jung noted parallels between synchronistic phenomena and Chinese understanding of the Tao, and the ancient Greek conception of cosmic sympathy of all things, the Hermetic doctrine of microcosm and macrocosm, and the medieval and Renaissance theory of correspondence, and the medieval concept of the pre-existent ultimate unity of all existence, the unus mundus, the unitary world. The Renaissance theory and medieval theory of correspondences. I'm interested in that. Moving on. In each case of synchronicity, Jung discerned an underlying archetypal coherence that linked the otherwise unconnected events, informed the larger field of meaning, and gave to the time of the synchronicity's occurrence a specific fundamental quality. In the first case cited above, for example, the symbolically charged image of the golden scarab expressed the archetypal principle of rebirth and renewal, visible in the Egyptian myth of the sun god who, in the netherworld during the night sea journey, changes himself into a scarab, then mounts the barge to rise again, reborn into the morning sky at dawn. In Egyptian religion, the mythic journey of the sun mediated the spiritual journey of the soul, providing the individual with a transformative symbolic pattern of descent and renewal, death and rebirth. It's all about death and rebirth, honestly, the crucifixion story. The case of the stopped watch, by contrast, was pervasively informed by the complex archetype of Saturn Chronos, the Senex principle, a central symbol and figure in the Western cultural tradition from the ancient Greek and Hellenistic era through Middle Ages and Renaissance. In this synchronicity, the Saturn archetype was visible not only in all the concrete details involving time, but also in the intricately interrelated themes of stoppage and being stuck, of opposition and rejection, error, fault, correction, judgment and self-judgment, superego. Each element and stage of the event suggested another dimension of the Saturn principles' multivalent spectrum of meaning. It can mean the precise meeting time, the task at hand, the problem to be solved, the pronouncement of judgments, the strife of disagreement, the attempt to bring an end to the task, the careful checking and comparing of the time, the act of negation and criticism, first directed outward towards the other and then inward towards the self, the self-correction followed by repetition, engaging the problem again and trying this time to get it right. Finally, the overarching themes deciding the fate of the manuscript, judging the legacy of the deceased, death as the stopping of time, all characteristic expressions of Saturn and the Senex discernible within the hour of the meeting. Those were just like things that Saturn could be about. Because synchronicity seemed to reflect and embody the same archetypal forms that Jung and many others came to see as basic underlying principles of the human psyche, the occurrence and recognition of such meaningful coincidences gave a crucial new dimension to the archetypal perspective. The empirical conformity between the event occurring in the external world and the archetypal quality of the internal state of consciousness suggested that the active archetype could not be localized as an exclusively subjective intrapsychic reality. The empirical conformity between the event occurring in the external world and the archetypal quality of the internal state of consciousness suggested that the active archetype cannot be localized as an exclusively subjective intrapsychic reality. Rather, both psyche and world, inner and outer, were informed by the archetypal pattern and thereby united by the correlation. It was specifically the experiential potency of this spontaneous archetypal resonance that seemed to act as a healing solvent on the hardened polarities between self and world, subject and object, conscious and unconscious of the person experiencing the synchronicity. Block quote. The collective unconscious surrounds us on all sides. It is more like an atmosphere in which we live than something that is found in us. Also, it does not by any means behave merely psychologically. In the cases of so-called synchronicity, it proves to be a universal substrate present in the environment rather than a psychological premise. Wherever we come into contact with an archetype, we enter into relationship with transconscious metapsychic factors. Unquote. This development in Jung's thought thus constituted a major shift in his understanding of the religious situation confronting the modern psyche. From early in his career, Jung saw both the psychological and the spiritual path of the modern self as requiring a sustained direct encounter with the archetypal unconscious. Here lay the possibility not only of deeper psychological self-awareness, but also of spiritual transformation, permitting an engagement with those numinous realities that could profoundly heal the psyche and provide it with an orienting purpose and transcendent meaning. Throughout most of his writings, this engagement was understood as taking place within what Jung essentially regarded as the sacred circle of the human psyche. Eventually, however, Jung's many years of studying synchronicities moved him to recognize this engagement as something that is enacted within the larger sacred circle of nature as a whole. In this perspective, not just the interior depths of the human psyche, but also the interior depths of nature itself supports the unfolding of human spirituality and each person's struggle towards individuation. The recognition of synchronicity's potential metaphysical implications not only suggested a transformation in the psychology of religion, it represented a critical step towards bridging the schism between religion and science in the modern era, so long embodied in the seemingly unbridgeable chasm between psyche and world. As the physicist Victor Mansfield has written, speaking for many, quote, I have encountered too many synchronistic experiences both in my life and that of others to ignore them, yet these surprisingly common experiences pose tremendous psychological and philosophical challenges for our worldview. They are especially troubling experiences for me as a physicist trained within the culture of scientific materialism. With these implications in mind, both philosophical and psychological, Jung's student and close associate, Marie-Louise von Franz, stated in an interview late in her life that, quote, the work which is now to be done is to work out the concept of synchronicity. I don't know the people who will continue it. They must exist, but I don't know where they are. Despite synchronicity's enigmatic and often readily dismissed character, it was with such humble clues that Jung began to open up the possibility of a fundamental redefinition of both the modern religious situation and the scientific world picture, beyond the closed universe of the spiritually aspiring psyche encompassed by a disenchanted world. Recalling the diagram illustrating the modern worldview, the existence of synchronicities implied that the large outer circle representing the world can no longer be seen as a definitively meaningless void. The dynamic relationship between different dimensions of being, both between the human self and the encompassing world and between conscious and the unconscious, had to be reconceived. It appears to have been Jung's growing recognition of the magnitude of these implications for the modern worldview that impelled him to labor so strenuously, even courageously, to bring critical awareness of the phenomenon of synchronicity into the intellectual discourse of the 20th century. The psychological and spiritual quest of the modern self now extended beyond an exclusively subjective intrapsychic horizon, for that quest took place within the matrix of a world that evidently possessed an intrinsic capacity for expressing and supporting meaning and purpose. Subtly and tenuously, the larger context within which the modern psyche pursued its search for wholeness had begun to shift. Alright, so that is the section on synchronicity. The next section is on the archetypal cosmos, and I think that's going to be a really important section that brings it to the archetypal cosmos. Seems interesting to me. I just thought of something. If these videos are too slow, YouTube does have a speed up feature. You could watch them at like 1.5 or 2 times the speed. Always make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm probably going to do more. This has been a fun book to read. Thanks for watching.